Okay, so you've just bought a lovely new cross-stitch pattern or kit, and then you realise it calls for metallic threads. Well, don't throw it in your cross-stitch project graveyard just yet, because I'm here to tell you there are ways that you can cross-stitch with metallic thread without it being a complete nightmare. Hi there, Stitchy friends. I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your cross-stitching. Well, I certainly have a bit of a love-hate relationship with metallic threads. I love the way they look, but not so much actually working with them. They just seem to want to knot, fray, tangle, and the stitches never really seem to want to lie nice and flat. But I've also picked up lots of tips along the way to help make stitching with them actually quite a lot easier, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. Now, there are actually quite a lot of different brands of metallic threads and braids available, but this is the most common one. This is DMC Light Effects thread. Ironically, it's probably also the trickiest one to work with. So this thread is multiple stranded, so you'd pull out a single strand to work with like regular cotton. Some of the other brands are also like this, or some are used as they come in a single strand. I'm not going to be diving into the types and brands today, but I'll definitely be looking at that in future. So, what's the problem with metallic threads? Well, if I pull out a single strand, like this, you can see this is fraying already at the end. And I haven't even started stitching yet. The other problem is that metallic thread also suffers a lot from wear and tear. So a lot of my tips are aimed at reducing this. Now, what I mean by wear and tear is that as you stitch with a thread and pull it through the holes, it will rub against itself, against the fabric, and against the eye of the needle. And all of that can cause the thread to get fluffier or more raggedy the longer you stitch with it. And that can make your stitches look less neat and increase the risk of the thread knotting and tangling. Obviously, this is potentially a problem for any thread, but it's a much bigger deal for metallic threads because they're slightly rougher and thicker than a regular thread. So, anything that reduces wear and tear is going to be super helpful. Okay, I think we're ready to dive into some tips. So tip number 1 is to use shorter lengths of thread. This can reduce the risk of knots and tangles for any thread, but obviously this is going to be especially great for metallic threads. It also reduces wear and tear on the thread and simply gives it less time for it to get all frayed at the ends because you're not going to be working with it for as long. So I always do this with my metallic threads. So this is a standard working length of thread for me. That's a metre of thread and I would fold it in half to give me 50 centimetres of working thread. But for metallic threads, I would go with this. This is about 60 centimetres of thread and I'd fold that in half to give me about 30 centimetres of working thread. So have a play around and see what length works best for you. You want something that isn't so short that you can only make a few stitches with it, but not so long that you find it constantly tangling or fraying. Tip number 2 is to use a bigger needle. Now, I've talked before about how to choose the best size needle for cross stitch, and I'll pop that in the cards for you if you want to take a look at that. Stitching with metallic threads is one of those occasions when it can be helpful not to go too small with your needle. So even though I usually like a size 26 needle for 14 or 16 count Ada, it can be useful to use a slightly bigger needle, such as this size 24. As you can see, it just has a slightly bigger eye, which will make it easier to thread. And it also widens the holes a little bit as it goes through them. Now, usually this isn't something I'd want, but with metallic threads, having the holes wider means that the thread will pass through more easily, so that will reduce wear and tear as well. Tip number 3 is to knot your thread onto your needle. So here's the most useful tip I've found for eliminating frayed ends, but it does only work if you're using 2 strands, because you're going to fold your thread in half, push the loop end through the needle, and then take your needle and put it through the loop and pull it tight. So your thread's now knotted onto the end of your needle. So now it won't slip around as you're stitching and you won't have any frayed ends. Obviously, this does mean you can't use a loop start because you'll need to run these ends underneath to start your stitching, but it's totally worth it because your thread now won't slip or unravel as you stitch or get all those frayed ends. You might have spotted the other downside to this, which is that unpicking stitches is really quite a nuisance, because you can't simply unthread your needle, unpick it and rethread it, because you'd have to cut it off the end of the needle when you're finished. Tip number 4 is to use thread conditioner. Now, I never use this for regular cotton thread, but I found it to be an absolute game changer for metallic threads. So thread conditioner is a wax that you use to coat your thread to make it glide through the fabric more easily. I've got Thread Heaven here, which is sadly now discontinued, but any thread conditioner will be fine. And to use it, you take the thread, place it on top of the wax, put your thumb over the top, and then just pull so that the wax coats the thread. And you can do it a couple of times. Pull that through, and now your thread is coated with wax. You can run up and down a few times just to distribute that evenly. Now, the downside to this is you'll see, as I've done this, I've now just made those frayed ends even worse. So you might actually want to cut your thread a bit longer than you want to use, because you know you're going to lose a little bit of it if you put it through the thread conditioner. Tip number 5 is to untwist your thread as you stitch. Now, this goes for all threads to help reduce it knotting and tangling, but again, it's especially helpful for metallic threads. Now, I have a video showing you 3 ways to do this, so I won't go through it all again here, but I'll pop a link to that in the card for you if you want to take a look at that. So tip number 6 is to leave longer tails. I find that metallic thread can be, well, kind of springier than cotton thread, and I find if I only run the ends in under 3 to 4 stitches, as I would with regular cotton thread, then the ends tend to free themselves and end up hanging loose on the back. So when I run my thread in at the start or end, I like to go under more stitches, maybe 5 or 6 if I can. And then I'll probably snip those ends off, maybe even a fraction longer than I normally would. Tip number 7 is leave metallic elements until the end. Now, this isn't always possible depending on the pattern, but I find that metallic threads can much more easily become snagged while you work, or those ends will still somehow slip loose. So if I can, I leave any metallic stitching until the very last minute. So, like adding in these silver polka dots at the end. Tip number 8 is take your time. I know I find myself saying this for quite a lot of things, but patience really is a virtue when stitching with metallic thread. Now, I like to stitch really fast, but for metallic threads, it's absolutely worth taking the time to pull each stitch through a bit more slowly and carefully, just to reduce the friction and, of course, then the wear and tear on your thread. It can also be trickier to avoid splitting threads when making stitches next to each other, and it's harder to get the stitches to lie nicely, so slowing down will help with this too. One other thing you can try with metallic threads is railroading your cross stitches, and I have a video on that too, so if you'd like to see that, then I'll pop that in the card for you. So I genuinely find that by using all the tips that I've outlined in this video, that metallic threads really aren't so much of a nightmare to work with after all. I also mentioned that there are some different brands and types of metallic threads, and that's really too much to cover today. We think we've already covered enough, but I will be doing a follow-up video all about those different brands and types. Because believe it or not, there are actually some metallic threads that are quite nice to stitch with. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss that or any of the other good stitchy stuff that I have lined up for you, then make sure to click that subscribe button. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found the tips helpful. And if so, please give this video a like, because it helps more people to find it who can also benefit. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!